one of the most unsettling, forgotten cases of the American frontier. Today we step into the hill country of northern Missouri, where an old wagon road and a farmhouse at the edge of the trees became the last thing 3 missing men ever saw. In this place, Lucie, Mae, and Ellen Turner would become names spoken only in whispers. A story the town buried, but one that the road itself never let go of. There is a particular kind of quiet that belongs only to the rural Missouri hills in late autumn. The kind that settles over the land like a second skin, soft and heavy, and reassuring in the way that only familiar things can be. On the morning of October 3, 1891, the town of Harlow Creek was doing what it had always done, and what it fully intended to keep doing for as long as the hills allowed it. Old Gideon Marsh was splitting logs behind his house at the edge of Main Street, his axe rising and falling in a rhythm so steady it could have been a clock. The widow Calloway was hanging laundry on a line strung between 2 oak trees, and the sheets moved in the cool breeze like slow, indifferent ghosts. 3 children chased a dog through the gap between the general store and the feed shed, shrieking with the particular joyful carelessness of children who have never had a reason to be afraid of open spaces. It was the kind of morning that made a man believe the world was exactly the size it appeared to be. No larger, no deeper, no darker. Marshal Daniel Harper rode into town just after 9, his bay horse tired from the long road north. He had been called out from the county seat in Gallatin by a letter that said only what letters of that kind always said. Men are missing. Nobody knows why. Come when you can. He had come as soon as he could, which was 3 days after receiving the letter, because 3 days was how long it took to close out the business he had left behind and make the ride north through country that grew quieter and more closed off with every mile. Harper was not a man who needed the comfort of noise or company. He had spent enough years in the army learning to be comfortable with silence. But the silence of the northern Missouri hills was a different variety than the one he was used to. It had a quality to it, a texture, as though the silence itself were listening. He tied his horse in front of the sheriff's office and went inside. Sheriff Amos Keel was a thick man in his late 50s, with a gray beard and the expression of someone who had long since run out of patience for surprises. He shook Harper's hand with a grip that was more than it needed to be, and poured 2 cups of coffee without asking whether one was wanted. The first man to go missing was Calvin Pruitt, Keel said. He was a dry goods salesman out of St. Joseph, came through here every 6 or 8 weeks, regular as rain. His wife came looking for him in late August, after he didn't return from his route. Last person to see him was Ben Aldrich, who farms about 4 miles east of here, on the Orchard Road. Said Pruitt was heading further east, toward the old Turner property. Harper drank his coffee and listened. Keel went on. The second was a Methodist circuit preacher named Josiah Cole. 60 years old, walked everywhere, knew these roads better than most. He was making his rounds in September. Last confirmed sighting put him on the same road, heading the same direction. The third was a young man, barely 20, name of Tom Whitfield, who was hired out to help with harvest on a farm up near the county line. He left his employer's house on a Tuesday morning and was never seen again. All 3 on the same road. All 3 last seen heading east. Harper set down his cup. And the Turner property is east. Keel looked at him with an expression that was not quite confirmation and not quite denial. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "There are 3 sisters living out there. Been there since their father died 2 years back." The old man, Silas Turner, was not a social type. Neither are his daughters. Nobody goes out there much. Nobody has a particular reason to. But the road passes close by their farm, and men who travel that road have a way of not arriving where they were going. Harper asked if anyone had spoken to the sisters. Keel said that his deputy had ridden out in September after the preacher went missing. He said the eldest one, Lucie, came to the door. Said they hadn't seen anyone. Said it in the way that people say things when they don't especially care whether you believe them or not. Harper rode out to look at the road that afternoon. It was narrow and deeply rutted, running east through a corridor of old oaks whose branches had grown together overhead, so that even on a clear day the light came down in pale fragments, like something broken. The road was quiet in a way that made his horse uneasy. The animal kept turning its ears back and forward, testing the air for something that Harper could not detect. 2 miles out from town, the road curved south and then east again, and from the top of a low rise he could see, at a distance of perhaps half a mile, the Turner farm. It sat in a shallow depression between 2 wooded ridges. The house was 2 stories, gray and weathered. A barn stood to one side, its roof sagging on the left. There was a garden that had gone half to seed, and beyond it, up the slope, the dark line of the tree line began. The place did not look evil. It looked old and tired and indifferent. But there was a smell on the air as he sat looking at it, faint and carried on the wind from the east, that he could not quite name. He rode back to town before the sun touched the hills. He did not look behind him, though he was aware, in the way a man with military experience becomes aware of such things, that the silence behind him was no longer empty. He went out to the farm the next morning alone. He had considered asking Keel to accompany him, but decided against it. He had learned over 20 years of marshalling that people spoke differently to one man than to 2, and that the presence of local authority often closed doors that a stranger might find open, if only by a crack. He rode in slowly and tied his horse at the post near the gate and walked up to the door and knocked. There was a pause of unusual length before the door opened. The woman who opened it was perhaps 26, with dark hair pulled back and pale eyes that assessed him with the calm, unhurried attention of someone who had never needed to pretend interest she did not feel. She was dressed plainly in gray cotton. Her hands were clean. Behind her, visible for only a moment before they drew back, were 2 other women, younger, darker-haired, identical to each other in a way that the eldest was not quite identical to them, as though they had been cast from the same mold at the same time, while she had been cast separately and earlier. "My name is Daniel Harper. I'm a federal marshal out of Davis County. I'm looking into some disappearances on this road, and I'd appreciate a few minutes of your time." She looked at him without any of the flustered courtesy that such an introduction usually produced in people who had nothing to hide and were mildly concerned by a visit from the law. She said, "Come in," and stepped back. The inside of the house was tidy in a way that was more methodical than comfortable. Everything was in its place, but the place of everything felt decided by a logic that had nothing to do with warmth or habit. There was a kitchen table with 3 chairs, a fireplace with a low fire burning despite the mildness of the morning, 3 cups on the shelf, all the same, all turned the same direction. The younger sisters sat down at the table when the eldest sat down, and they sat the same way, hands folded in their laps, their faces turned toward Harper with the same angle of attention. He introduced himself again for the benefit of all 3 and asked their names. The eldest said her name was Lucille, but that people called her Lucie. The younger 2 gave their names as Mae and Ellen. He noticed that they gave them in the same tone and with the same small pause before speaking, as though answering a question they had already agreed on the answer to. He asked them about the salesman, Calvin Pruitt. He described the man's route and the general time period, and watched their faces. There was nothing to watch. He asked about the preacher, Josiah Cole. He asked about Tom Whitfield. The same answer each time, delivered by Lucie while the other two remained still. We don't have visitors. We keep to ourselves. We wouldn't know. He asked whether they ever saw travelers on the road. Lucie said that the road passed to the north of the property and that they had no reason to watch it. He asked whether he might look around the property. She said, "You're welcome to look at whatever you can see from where you are." He recognized the legal precision of the answer and did not push. He thanked them and stood and moved toward the door. At the threshold he stopped and turned, not because he had planned to, but because something made him. Lucie was watching him with an expression that was not threatening and not curious. It was the expression of someone watching a thing move through space with a trajectory already known to them. He rode back slowly. He stopped at the rise where he had stopped the evening before and looked at the farm for a long time. Nothing moved. No smoke rose from the chimney now. No figures appeared in the yard or at the windows. The farm sat below him in the gray morning light, as still and patient as an old stone. That evening, a farmer named Robert Cass came into town to report that a peddler who had spent the night at his house 2 days before had been heading east on the Orchard Road and had not, as far as Cass knew, arrived anywhere after that. Harper went to see Judge Warren the following morning. The warrant came through on a Thursday. Harper rode out with Keel and 2 deputies, men named Frank Hollis and Arthur Greer, both of whom had lived in Harlow Creek their entire lives, and rode with the particular stiffness of men doing something they would rather not be doing. Lucie Turner answered the door before they knocked. Harper had the thought, brief and quickly dismissed, that she had known they were coming. He presented the warrant. She read it without hurry and handed it back and stepped aside. Mae and Ellen were at the table, positioned as before. The 3 of them watched the search with faces that expressed nothing at all. Hollis and Greer moved through the upper floor. Harper and Keel worked the ground level. The kitchen, the front room, the small room at the back that served as some kind of workroom or storage. Nothing apparent. But Harper had spent 20 years not being satisfied with nothing apparent. He moved slowly. He looked at the floor. He looked at where the floor had been disturbed and settled, and disturbed again. In the back corner of the workroom, behind a shelf holding mason jars of preserved goods, he found it. The shelf moved. Behind it was a door in the floor, heavy wood, iron handle, fitted so precisely into the planks around it that it would have been invisible to anyone not looking for exactly that kind of thing. He called Keel. They looked at each other. Keel looked toward the main room where the sisters were sitting. Harper lifted the door. The smell came up immediately. It was not dramatic. It was low and persistent, the smell of something organic that had undergone a change. Rot and char together. 2 different processes that had occurred in the same space. Keel took a step back. Harper took the lantern from the shelf and held it over the opening and looked down. The cellar was not large, perhaps 10 feet by 12, cut into the earth and clay beneath the house, the walls shored up with rough timber. The floor was hard dirt, and on the floor, arranged along the walls with a neatness that made everything worse, were belongings. A leather satchel with a monogrammed latch, the kind a traveling salesman would carry. A hat, black, broad-brimmed, with a band of silver thread that matched the description of the hat that Josiah Cole was said to never travel without. A carpet bag, 3 different pairs of boots, folded shirts, a watch on a leather strap, a small Bible with a name written inside the cover in careful ink. The name belonging to a man who had left St. Joseph in August and never come back. And in the far corner, on a patch of floor darker than the rest, a shallow pile of material that the lantern light revealed as fragments. Small, pale, irregular. Bone. Burned and small and numerous. The kind of remains produced by fire that has been given sufficient time and attention. The walls of the cellar had been marked. The marks were not painted or drawn. They had been cut into the timber, deep and precise. Geometric forms that interlocked with each other in patterns that made the eye want to follow them, and then made the eye want to stop. Keel looked at the marks for a few seconds, and then looked away. Harper looked at them longer. There was something about the patterns that suggested not decoration, but instruction. Not symbol in the ornamental sense, but symbol in the communicative sense, as though the marks were addressed to something. He climbed back up. The sisters had not moved. He told Hollis and Greer to take them. It was when the deputies moved toward Mae and Ellen that Lucie spoke. Not loudly, not urgently, in the same level tone she had used throughout. She said, "You found what you were meant to find." Harper looked at her. He asked what that meant. She said nothing further. She stood when asked to stand and walked out of the house ahead of the deputies without being guided, as though she knew the direction already. They were held in the county jail in Gallatin through November, while the prosecutor, a man named Edward Story, assembled his case. The circumstances were legally difficult. The belongings found in the cellar were identifiable and damning. The bone fragments were confirmed by a physician to be human remains, multiple individuals, subjected to sustained burning. But there were no intact bodies. There were no witnesses to any act of violence. There were 3 women who did not speak in their own defense and did not provide anything that could be called a confession. The sisters were held in separate cells at the recommendation of the physician who examined them. He was a careful man named Dr. Samuel Elliott, who wrote in his report that the 3 women demonstrated behavioral patterns that were, in his clinical opinion, without precedent in his experience. They gave no responses to physical stimuli in the expected range. They showed no affect when informed of the charges against them or the likely consequences. When separated, each woman positioned herself in the corner of her cell and remained there for periods of hours without sitting, without sleeping, without apparent discomfort. The guards reported that the women moved at the same times, that if one raised her hand to her face, the other 2 did the same within moments, despite the walls between them and the physical impossibility of observing each other. One guard refused to continue his assignment after the second night. He told Keel, who told Harper, that he had heard whispers at 3 in the morning, not from one cell, but from all 3 simultaneously, a low rhythmic sound that was not quite language, that he was not willing to listen to a 3rd time. Harper went to see Lucie on the day before the trial opened. She was standing in the corner of her cell, facing the wall, her hands at her sides. When he came in, she turned, not quickly, not as though startled, but with the slow rotation of something that had known he was there before he arrived. He sat down across from her and told her plainly that the evidence against them was substantial, that the jury would likely convict, and that the sentence, in all probability, would be death. He told her that if she or her sisters had anything to say in their defense, now was the time. He told her that he was not there to frighten her or to manipulate her, but because he believed in the process of the law, and the process included the right of the accused to be heard. She looked at him for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "You are a careful man." She said it without judgment, as an observation. "You measure things before you step on them." She tilted her head slightly. "That is a good way to live in the world you know. In another world, it would not help you." He asked her what world she meant. she turned back to the wall. She did not speak again that visit, or at any subsequent visit. The trial lasted 4 days. Story presented his evidence methodically. The families of the missing identified the belongings. The physician testified about the bone fragments and the behavioral observations. 2 residents of Harlow Creek testified that all 3 missing men had been heading east on the Orchard Road on the days they disappeared. Aldrich, who had last seen Pruitt alive, described the direction the man was riding and the time of day, and confirmed that the Turner farm lay precisely in that direction. The defense attorney, a young man from Gallatin named Robert Marsh, who had been appointed by the court, and who had the expression of someone carrying a weight he had not agreed to carry, attempted to argue that circumstantial evidence was not sufficient for conviction, that no act of violence had been witnessed, and that his client's unusual behavior was evidence of mental impairment rather than criminal intent. The jury listened. Their faces indicated that they had already decided. On the final day, before the verdict was read, Judge Thomas Aldgate asked the defendants if they wished to address the court. Harper, seated at the back of the room, watched the 3 sisters where they sat at the defense table. Mae and Ellen were still. Lucie turned her head slowly and looked at the jury with a gaze that moved from face to face with the deliberate patience of something reading a page. Several jurors looked at the table. One of them, a farmer named Gerald Pickett, who had the reputation of a steady and unimpressible man, went visibly pale. Then Lucie looked at Harper. He did not look away. She held his gaze for a long moment, and he had the distinct experience, not mystical, not supernatural, but entirely physical and entirely unwelcome, that he was looking at something that existed at a different scale than the room they were both sitting in. Something that found the room, the trial, the law, the judge, and the marshal himself to be very small. She said, "The road opens again." Those were her only words. Mae and Ellen turned their heads at the same moment and looked at the judge with the same expression their sister had used on the jury. The judge called for order. The verdict, guilty on all counts, was read 20 minutes later. The execution was set for the 22nd of November. A scaffold had been constructed in the yard behind the county jail. It was functional and without ceremony. 3 drops, 3 ropes, built by a carpenter who had done this before and did not waste lumber. The morning of the 22nd arrived with a sky the color of old iron and a wind coming from the northwest that smelled of coming weather. The crowd that gathered was large for a town of Gallatin's size. People had come in from the surrounding counties. There were families of the missing among them. There were also people who had come for other reasons, the kind of people who attend such events and stand at the edges and do not speak to anyone. The sisters were brought out together for the first time since their arrest. They walked in step, their chains making a sound on the cold ground, their breath visible in the morning air. They climbed the scaffold steps without assistance, without hesitation, as though they had climbed them before and knew exactly how many there were. The minister who was present to offer last rites spoke briefly and then stopped speaking. He said afterward that he had lost the words, that they had simply gone from him while he was speaking, as though taken. He stepped back. The executioner, a professional brought in from Kansas City, checked the ropes and positioned the 3 women under them. He was competent and expressionless, and he looked at none of them directly. The judge read the sentence aloud. He asked if there were final words. All 3 of them spoke at once. The voices were identical in pitch and timing, 3 instruments producing one sound. They said, "The road opens again. The road is always open. Come back to us when you remember the way." They said it once, and then they were silent. The executioner pulled the mechanism. The 3 drops fell. The crowd went still, with the specific stillness of people who have seen something they expected to see, but find, now that it has happened, that they did not know what seeing it would feel like. And then the storm came. It did not build. It arrived, all at once, as though it had been standing just beyond the edge of the visible world, waiting for a signal. The wind doubled in strength in an instant, tearing hats from heads and scattering papers. The sky darkened in a way that was total and immediate, going from gray to near black in the time it takes to draw a breath. Lightning struck the eastern hill twice in rapid succession, and in the interval between the two strikes, in the valley where the orchard road ran east between the old oaks, every person who was facing that direction saw it, or thought they saw it. 3 pale shapes standing at the edge of the tree line on the hill, motionless in the storm, facing the town. Harper saw them. He stood in the open yard with rain driving into him, and he watched that hillside, and he counted 3 shapes, and he watched them stand without moving through 2 more lightning strikes, and then, on the 3rd strike, they were gone. The bodies were pronounced dead by the physician. They were placed in plain pine coffins and taken to the cemetery on the west end of town. The horses drawing the wagon fought the entire way. The burial was accomplished in driving rain, without ceremony, without markers. In the spring of 1894, 2.5 years after the execution, a schoolteacher from a college in Columbia named Arthur Vane came to Gallatin with a scholarly interest in the case. He had read the trial record, which was partial, and a few newspaper accounts, which were sensational, and he wanted to find out what was true and what was invention. He interviewed Harper, who was still serving as marshal, and who answered questions in the precise, minimal way of a man who has thought carefully about what he is and is not willing to say. Vane asked whether Harper believed the sisters were guilty. Harper said the evidence indicated that they were responsible for the deaths of at least 3 men. Vane asked whether Harper believed they had acted alone. Harper looked at him for a moment and said, "I don't know what they acted for. That's the honest answer." Vane rode out to the Turner farm. The house was still standing, abandoned now, the windows dark. The garden had gone completely to wildness, the barn half collapsed. He went inside. The marks on the cellar walls were still there. He had read the descriptions in the trial record and had expected them to be less impressive in person. They were not less impressive. They were, if anything, more so. In the 2.5 years since the search, they had not faded or decayed with the timber around them. They had not been altered by weather or time. They looked as fresh as if they had been cut that morning. And there were more of them. Significantly more. The marks now covered not just the cellar walls, but the interior walls of the ground floor, running from floor to ceiling in patterns that matched what was below. Vane counted the new marks. He spent 3 hours attempting to document them in his notebooks. He found that after a certain period of looking at them, he lost track of what he had already drawn and had to stop. He left the house before sunset, which he had told himself he would not do, but did anyway, and rode back to Gallatin faster than was prudent on that road. He did not publish his research. He returned to Columbia, and within 2 years had taken a position at a university in Boston and left Missouri entirely. The notes from his visit were found in his papers after his death in 1931 and donated to an archive where they are presently held and infrequently consulted. The disappearances on the Orchard Road did not stop. They became less frequent after the execution, less concentrated, easier to explain by ordinary means. A man lost in rough terrain. A traveler who changed his route without telling anyone. Accidents that happen to solitary people in isolated places. The kind of accidents that are not mysterious in themselves, but accumulate, over years, into a pattern that the people who live near that road know better than to speak about to outsiders. Sheriff Keel's deputy, Frank Hollis, left law enforcement in 1893 and moved to St. Louis, where he died in 1901. He told his wife, who told her sister, who eventually told a local historian many decades later, that in the last years he spent in Harlow Creek, he sometimes saw 3 women standing on the Orchard Road at night, always at a distance, always still, always gone when he rode toward them. He said he eventually stopped riding toward them because the distance between himself and the spot where they had been standing was never the same when he arrived as it had looked from far away. He could not explain this precisely. He said only that the road was longer going toward them than it appeared. Harper served as marshal until 1898. He was a methodical and effective officer, and he solved a considerable number of cases in those years, and was regarded by colleagues and civilians alike as a reliable and capable man. He never spoke publicly about the Turner case after Vane's visit. He never rode the Orchard Road after the execution. He retired to a house in Gallatin and lived quietly for another 16 years, and died in 1914 at the age of 64 of a cardiac event, which was unremarkable for a man of his age and history. Among his personal effects, found in a locked tin box in his desk drawer, was a single sheet of paper, folded twice and written in his own careful hand. On it, he had drawn, from memory, with considerable accuracy, the symbols from the Turner cellar walls. He had drawn them on both sides of the paper and run out of room and continued in the margins. At the bottom of the last margin, in smaller writing that looked like it had been added at a different time, perhaps much later, were 4 words. "They are not finished." What he meant by this was not explained, and was not explained by any other document in his effects. And the people who inventoried his possessions after his death were, with one exception, not familiar enough with the Turner case to recognize what they were looking at. The one exception was a deputy who had been a boy of 12 in 1891 and had stood in the crowd on the day of the execution and had seen, or believed he had seen, the shapes on the eastern hill. He recognized the symbols. He took the paper out of the box and put it in his pocket, and later burned it, a decision he made quickly and for reasons he never attempted to explain to anyone. He was 63 years old at the time. He had lived in Harlow Creek his entire life. He knew better. In the hills east of Gallatin, on the road that runs between the old oaks, travelers sometimes stop. They stop because they hear something. It comes from the east, from the direction of the old Turner property and the tree line above it, faint and steady, and carried on whatever wind is moving through the valley. 3 voices in a harmony that has no name in any musical tradition that anyone has been able to identify. It sounds like a song that is also a call, like a question that already knows its answer, like a door that has been open for a very long time, patiently in the dark, waiting for someone to remember they were invited. The road east is still there. It still runs through the oaks. The ruts have deepened, and the branches have grown lower, and some of the old farms along it have been empty for decades now. Their owners moved away for reasons they gave as practical, and which may well have been. People who know the area tell visitors to stay on the main road after dark. They say it without drama, the way you tell someone the stairs are slippery or the well water tastes of iron. Just information. Just the local knowledge of people who have lived long enough in a place to learn what it requires of them. 3 people were convicted and hanged in November of 1891 for the murders of at least 3 men on that road. The law found them guilty, and the law carried out its sentence, and the law considered the matter closed. The matter considered the law to be a very recent and very temporary arrangement, and went on doing what it had always done, quietly, without hurry, with the patience of something that has no reason to rush, because it has never once, in all the long time it has existed, failed to find what it was looking for.